Hello, here we are back again with episode 29 of Smart Prosperity, the podcast. It's a bi-weekly show about the green economy in Canada, the current affairs, the politics, the business, the technology, and the ideas at the intersection of the environment and the economy. I'm your host, Eric Campbell. On today's show, don't look now, we're in a fossil fuel boom. How does that work when the world has just scaled up its climate commitments? I speak to the International Energy Agency's Tim Gold, and for the Canadian context, speak with analysts Jackie Forrest and Aaron Cosby. After that, we'll hear a 60-second summary of a major new report, and then we cap it all off with our regular list of 5 other things happening in the green economy this week. That's today's agenda. Let's get started. Yeah, speaking of walking contradictions, how about current energy and climate trends? Whereas on one hand, we've got international leaders just returning from Glasgow with new and more ambitious climate pledges to phase down coal to get off of fossil fuels. On the other hand, we've got global energy demand for those very fossil fuels booming. So much so that the International Energy Agency says that right now, at this very moment, the skyrocketing oil, coal, and natural gas consumption is driving the second biggest increase in greenhouse gas emissions the world has ever known. The walking contradiction between the oil boom and the climate imperative is also playing out domestically. In the U.S., Joe Biden is pushing historic clean energy investments. But at the same time, he's pleading with oil-producing countries to release their oil reserves and make oil more available and more affordable. European countries are making similar pleas for natural gas. So what gives? Why the walking contradictions? And is the current fossil fuel boom going to undermine our climate efforts? Well, today we're going to try to make sense of all this. First by looking at the global picture, and then by looking at the dynamics here in Canada. Let's start by looking at the global picture. To do that, I'm welcoming Tim Gold. Tim is Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency and the lead on that agency's annual World Energy Outlook publication. I'm reaching him in Paris. Tim, thanks for joining the show.
Hi, Eric. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Tim, the IEA is seeing a surge in energy demand coming out of COVID-19. Tell us about that surge and how much of that surge is being met with fossil fuels like coal and oil.
It's certainly been true that we've seen that surge in energy demand, and most of it, as your question intimated, has been met by fossil fuels. So in the first half of this year, global gas demand was growing year on year by about 5%, higher for oil by 7%, and most disturbing of all from an environmental perspective, and coal demand was up year on year by more than 10%. So indeed, there's been a surge in energy demand this year. A lot of that has been caused just by the economic rebound from last year's slump. It's particularly in the first 6 months of this year, we were in a very rapid sort of post-recession recovery. And there's been a few other factors that have pushed up demand as well. Weather's been an issue in many parts of the world. So you had, for example, a drought in Brazil. That meant that hydropower production in Brazil was down, and they took a lot more liquefied natural gas off the international market compared to usual. There's been a few other things, like during COVID, a lot of maintenance work on some big fields was postponed, and that came through in 2021, just at a moment when demand was picking up. I think we have to recognize also that some of the positions taken by major oil and gas suppliers have not been particularly helpful. Some analysts looking at today's energy markets see signs of so-called sort of artificial tightness there. And when you look at Gazprom gas storage in Europe, so the main Russian exporter to Europe, their level of gas storage in preparation for the winter heating season in Europe is remarkably low compared to where it is normally at this time of year. And that's certainly been a factor in tightening markets up. There's also in oil markets nearly 6 million barrels a day of spare production capacity held by the major producers in the sort of OPEC plus grouping. So there's been a number of things that have sort of come together to push up prices this year.
And Tim, how much of this was predictable? How much of this was the IEA projecting, back in 2020, and how much of this is, like the Brazil example that you cited? How much of this was unpredicted?
From very, very early on in this in the COVID crisis, and the IEA has been urging policymakers to make the recovery sustainable. Our thinking there was that we had an opportunity because governments, particularly in advanced economies, were going to mobilize funds to support economic recovery. And our argument went that, if you put enough of that funding into energy efficiency, into low emission sources of energy, you can sort of jolt the energy system onto a different set of rails. However, only a part of that funding has really come through. And particularly, the deficit has been particularly large in emerging and developing economies, which have had an extended public health crisis. Their sort of attention has been focused on managing that emergency rather than necessarily having the funds available to support sustainable recovery. So, in 2021, we've had another record year for renewables, but it didn't cover all the increase in electricity demand this year. So you've had a call on thermal generation, a call on coal in particular in Asia, that's pushed up emissions. And although we've seen some improvements in energy efficiency this year, we haven't seen the sorts of dramatic improvements that we would need in order to get us onto that different set of rails. So in our view, the sorts of improvements that you've seen in energy efficiency this year would need to double to get us on track to meet the climate goals that we were talking about at COP26 in Glasgow.
I see. Okay, and I want to get to those climate goals. First, just to understand, this picture that's emerging at the global level through this recovery and the energy trends happening there. Where are we at now compared to pre-COVID times in terms of that oil demand and coal and other fossil fuels?
So in the case of natural gas demand and coal demand, already this year, we're kind of getting back towards pre-crisis levels. In the case of oil, we're not there yet. If you look at our near-term view on oil markets, we'll get back there sometime in 2022. I mean, the main reason why oil, in a sense, has been at the back of the pack there is really because, we've had continued reluctance or, there's been changes, particularly in air transport, where the consumption of jet fuel remains well below pre-crisis levels. And that's something that's kept oil demand down. But as economies open up, that element of travel is coming back as well. I mean, we do see some structural effects, particularly for business travel, where companies are still relying on this kind of technology to communicate across international boundaries. But domestic travel, air travel, in many cases is bouncing back quite quickly.
Okay, so oil not quite as quickly as coal and natural gas, but it sounds like it's projected to grow. So if fossil fuels are having this gangbuster year, how long do you see this surge continuing for?
It really depends on how quickly governments move to implement the sort of policies they've been talking about in Glasgow. Because in our view, one of the key things that needs to change in the energy system is that we need to hear not just the announcement of new targets, but we need to see all the near-term actions that would allow those targets to be implemented in full. So we did some analysis in the New World Energy Outlook about what would it mean for energy markets if all of those announced pledges that you heard at COP26 were implemented. And what we found was that would already have quite significant implications for oil, gas, coal markets in the near term. So by the middle of this decade, you'd already have a plateau and then a decline in oil markets. You'd see some similar dynamics in natural gas markets. And naturally enough, as the most carbon-intensive fuel, a surge in spending on clean energy would also push coal into a faster structural decline. And that would need to happen, as soon as possible. So I guess the answer to your question is that the ball is back in the court of governments who have made all of these very positive noises about what they intend to do on climate and to actually implement those.
Okay. If countries follow through on these pledges that they've made at COP, we see a plateauing by the middle of this decade and then a decline afterwards. Early this year, the IEA for the first time modeled a pathway to a net zero emission global energy system and that 1.5 degree level of warming that scientists have warned that we need to stay within. At the time, you noted that it was a narrow pathway to that goal. Does this surge in oil demand throw us off of that pathway?
I don't think it throws us off that pathway irrevocably, but it certainly makes it even more challenging. And when we did that analysis earlier this year, as you say, we said it's challenging, it's narrow, it's tough, and remaining within that 1.5 degree limit is indeed. It is a very challenging trajectory for the energy sector, but we believe that it's possible. It's possible, but it requires a quick change in the speed of transitions and in the amount of investment that goes into a range of low emissions technologies, and that's something that we are worried about because right now, every year, the world invests just around $1 trillion into clean energy and the infrastructure that underpins a clean energy or a cleaner energy system. Now, $1 trillion is it's not nothing, but it's well short of what we would need to be spending in order to get us on that 1.5 degree trajectory. So by the latter part of this decade, we would need to be seeing sums around triple what we're spending now in order to really get us to meet rising demand for energy services in a sustainable way.
Okay, so if this global surge in fossil fuel demand continues, it will undermine the world's climate action. But whether or not this surge does continue is something to be determined over the next couple of years. Tim, it was great talking to you today. Thanks for being on Smart Prosperity, the podcast, and thanks for sharing a glimpse at the global context.
Thanks ever so much, Eric. Good to talk.
That was Tim Gold, Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency. Now, Canada, of course, is a major oil and gas producer, and that industry is also the single biggest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. So how are those global energy trends playing out here in Canada? And how does it all match up with Canada's climate efforts? To answer that, I'm first speaking with Jackie Forrest. Jackie is an energy analyst with 25 years' experience in the energy industry. She's the executive director of ARC Energy Research Institute and the host of the ARC Energy Ideas podcast, which you should check out. I'm reaching her in Calgary. Jackie, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
So, we've heard about what's happening globally from Tim Gold at the International Energy Agency. You're seeing front lines what's happening in Canada's oil and gas sector. What is happening there?
Yeah, it may surprise some of your listeners, but this is just a record year on many metrics for the oil and gas industry. Production has bounced back to be close to the 2019 levels, but obviously you've seen what's happened with oil and gas prices. So revenue is on track to be near record high, as well as cash flow. The Canadian oil and gas industry is, by our estimate, going to make something like $89 billion of cash flow, a number that hasn't been obtained since 2008 when the price of oil was over $100. Now, what's really changed, though, is that back in 2014 and before, the industry would take all the money that it had and then add some and put that all back into the economy. But what we're seeing today is all that cash flow, a big chunk of it is actually going back to shareholders. It's being used to pay down debt. It's not putting a bunch of Albertans and Western Canadian people back to work. And so that's one thing. Some people have called it the jobless recovery, in that it hasn't come with all the capital spending that we usually see when we have prices like this.
Interesting. And why is that? Why are we seeing, a ton of cash flow, a ton of output, but but not that reinvestment into the economy?
Well, there's been a real change in the investor base and what they expect. The view is that we don't need a bunch more oil, and that actually, if you go back in time and you look at those really high price periods in 2014, the industry wasn't really returning any profit to its shareholders, and they want to hold these companies now. They don't believe that oil demand is going to keep growing forever. They're holding them because they want to get dividends and get their money back that way. And so, there's a lot of pressure from shareholders to do that. And companies that have actually announced that they want to grow instead of give money back to their shareholders, in many cases have seen a reduction in their share price. And so the investors are really have changed the expectations here.
And so what does that mean? Obviously, so right now there's a boom happening. How long do you expect that boom to last? And these, slightly different dynamics from previous boom years, what does that mean about the next, 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the oil patch?
Yeah, I would just correct you. I wouldn't call it a boom. It certainly doesn't feel like a boom. A boom is usually when we see all that capital spending. So the companies are quite profitable, but we're not sort of seeing a boom here in the Alberta economy.
Okay.
In terms of who knows where, it's hard to forecast prices when you see all the ups and downs we've experienced over the last several years. But as we look out to 2022, there are some things that make us think that maybe prices could stay in that higher range. One is demand continues to improve. Although COVID's not completely behind us, we're just hoping that 2022 looks better than 2021, and that we're going to see, more demand for air travel and things like that. So the demand picture looks like it's going to improve. So those are really positive aspects. At the same time, OPEC, which is that cartel that has been actually constructive here in the last year. They've been really keeping a lot of supply off the market so that we don't see a big glut. But they've been quite careful not to add very much supply back to the market, which is part of the reason why prices have moved up so high. And so the view is that hopefully they'll continue to be relied on as a group that will manage the markets and not add too much supply back in.
Okay. Now you've already hinted that, the dynamics around, the current industry trends are different from in previous years. Coming out of COP26 in Glasgow, the international community rallying around some ratcheted up climate commitments. I'm curious about kind of the signal that this is sending to Canada's oil and gas sector and how they're interpreting that signal. And, is that what's impacting that capital investment, that growth that's not happening this year, as you say?
Well, I think the signal is actually coming not from necessarily the governments as much as investors, as we've already seen such a drastic change in the way that companies are spending because of investor pressure. It's something big that happened at COP was this Glasgow Financial Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is probably one of the biggest things, in my opinion, that came out of it. And basically, it was a large group of investors. Mark Carney's involved in it as well. And but they've signed on to reducing the emissions and things that they're invested in. And many banks have signed up to it too, to meet the net zero pledge, but also to meet something like a 50% reduction by 2030. And, these groups are going to make it increasingly hard for companies to raise capital or even get debt potentially if they don't sort of check all the boxes. And there's quite a bit of documentation from that group already in terms of the expectations that these investors and banks are going to have going forward in the money that they invest. So I think that trend has already been in place. This just amplifies it. And the industry is responding. I'm sure you saw the oil sands producers have created an alliance to reduce their emissions to net zero by 2050 and want to build a very large carbon capture storage project. It's called the Pathways Project, and numerous other oil and gas companies have pledged to get to net zero as well. So I think the fact that the companies are making money is really good, because I talked about the policy that's coming along to help support this. But at the end of the day, they need money to pay for a project, for a carbon capture storage project. These are multi-billion-dollar projects or a hydrogen project. So the fact that they're not growing and that they have excess cash flow, to me, increases the chances that they'll be successful at reducing their emissions, because ultimately someone has to pay for it.
Okay.
And so it's great. It's good to see that they have this cash flow, which will enable them to move in that direction.
Okay. Jackie, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for giving us this in-depth look at what's happening in Canada's oil and gas sector right now.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Enjoyed being on the podcast.
Okay, now that was Jackie Forrest, Executive Director of ARC Energy Research Institute. Now, to round out the Canadian picture at this moment in time, when there is a global boom in demand for fossil fuels, at the same time as accelerating efforts to combat climate change, I'm welcoming Aaron Cosbey. Aaron Cosbey is an economist and senior associate at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I'm reaching Aaron in Roslyn, BC. Aaron, thanks for being on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
Now, Aaron, we just heard from Jackie Forrest that there is this boom in production, at least, not happening economy-wide, but certainly in production and in output in Canada's oil and gas sector. Now, this isn't all that surprising to you. You authored a report earlier this year that projected just that. Tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the prediction was fairly obvious to all industry observers. You weren't seeing enough investment in upstream during the pandemic, and we knew that we would eventually come out of the pandemic with a boom in demand that would then tighten up supplies and send prices soaring. So none of this is surprising, really. But the long-term trends are what interested us. And so we looked at two things that are of particular interest to the Canadian sector as we look longer term. One is the effects of price volatility. And that means prices going up as well as prices going down, right? And we found that, if you're thinking about the contributions to Alberta's economy, the oil sector, under a scenario where you'd have volatile prices in line with historical volatility, the benefits you could expect to the Albertan economy in terms of investment, GDP contribution, employment contribution were hugely compromised, much more so than just a low oil price scenario. And we're seeing that play out.
We're experiencing that right now.
This boom is not going to last, right? So that's one effect that we see going out into the future, and it's a cautionary tale about the extent to which this sector is a sort of steady and reliable contributor to Alberta's prosperity. The other trend, though, of course, is the increasing demand destruction for oil globally as a result of the climate change actions taken by the global community. And the primary vector by which that occurs is promotion of electric vehicles for road transport making up some 44% of the demand globally for crude oil. And so our modeling says that destruction is going to be rained down on the sector, and you're not going to have a particularly large increase in demand out to 2030 in global demand for oil. And post-2030, it's going to be declining and chaotic.
Okay. And now if that plays out just as you modeled, how does that affect Canada's climate goals? If we've got a rise in demand that, peaks and begins to decline after 2030, what are the implications for Canada's climate goals?
Well, I mean, it depends on the emissions intensity of the sector, and that's a very hot question right now. So we had a promise in the Liberal campaign and a promise repeated again at COP26 by the Prime Minister and his Minister of the Environment and Climate Change that we would see sectoral targets going out to 2050 for the oil and gas sector that would achieve net zero by 2050. We don't know what those look like yet. They could be backloaded a great deal, but they are emissions intensity targets. So the intent is, the very probable intent is not to say you have to ramp down production, because that would be very unpopular, and constitutionally the government doesn't have a mandate to do that. The intent will be to say you have to ramp down emissions intensity, probably through use of technologies like carbon capture and storage, carbon capture use and storage. And here's a lot of public money to help you do it, because I think that's going to be the other side of that coin. If that does happen, if we see significant decarbonization of that sector, if that all happens according to those models, we may be able to do it. The sector would still be a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. But if you are decarbonizing, and if it's not a great rise in demand, you probably will see overall emissions in that sector falling by 2030.
So, Aaron, it sounds like in order for Canada to hit its 2030 goals, and certainly its 2050 goals, that emissions in Canada's oil sector will need to come down. And there's two ways for them to come down. One is by ramping down production overall, or the second is by decarbonizing the sector, which presumably means things like carbon capture and storage and more efficient production.
Yeah, and add electrification to that. If you get small nuclear reactors producing carbon-free electricity to the operations, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, that's a great summary.
Okay. Aaron, thanks for being on the show today.
No, it was my pleasure.
That was Aaron Cosby, Senior Associate at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So, there are some walking contradictions right now when it comes to energy trends, particularly the surging demand for oil, gas, and coal, including here in Canada. If you want to learn more about how it all lines up with the world's accelerating climate efforts, we've got some more information and materials for you on this episode's webpage at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Now it's time for the 60-second report. It's something we do every show. It's where we invite the author of a major new report to sum it all up in, 60 seconds or less. This week, we're featuring the new 2021 Energy Efficiency Report Card put out annually by Efficiency Canada. To sum up this year's report card, here is co-author Brendan Haley.
In this year's scorecard, BC comes in first place, followed by Quebec, and then Nova Scotia. There's been a 38% decrease in program energy savings from their peak in 2017. Now that's partly due to the pandemic, but it's largely driven by Ontario and Alberta canceling energy savings programs. Net zero building codes, it's another area where things have stalled. Only BC has committed to a net zero energy ready code and is now requiring all new buildings to be zero carbon. This delay, it's largely due to the national model codes that were supposed to be published in 2020 not yet being available. So to accelerate energy savings in all provinces, we recommend the federal government take leadership over building codes, also transform the energy retrofit process, and expand low-income energy efficiency.
Thank you, Brendan. To see the new Provincial Energy Efficiency Scorecard, we have a link to it on this episode's landing page, which you can see at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Now, there's a lot happening in the green economy every week. And for everything else, I turn to my colleague, Mike Moffat. Mike is a senior director here at Smart Prosperity Institute. And here he is with his regular list of 5 other things happening in the green economy this week. Over to you, Mike.
I'm Mike Moffat, and here are the 5 things that I'm watching this week. Number 1, British Columbia is under its second state of emergency due to extreme weather this year. Extreme rainfall has caused mudslides and flooding that have demolished homes and roads, isolated communities, and led to at least 4 deaths. The extreme weather, which is linked to climate change, is predicted to have caused more than $7.5 billion in damages. Number 2, a proposed electric vehicle tax credit in the United States is causing alarm for Canada's auto sector. The proposal would offer big subsidies for electric vehicles, so long as they are made in the United States. If enacted, it could significantly undermine Canadian producers, which are quickly scaling up and counting on fair access to the U.S. market. Number 3, the city of Calgary is the latest major Canadian city to declare a climate emergency. Newly elected mayor, Joe T. Gondek, tabled the motion and led council in a 13-2 vote in favor. The declaration includes a requirement for the city to hit net zero by 2050 and enables aggressive action to hit those targets. Number 4, Ontario's Auditor General released a scathing review of the provincial government's environmental record. Findings include the government not implementing 3/4 of its climate commitments, it deliberately neglecting responsibilities to consult and inform the public about decisions, and that it is automatically approving permits that harm species at risk. And number 5, Canada's fleet of Zambonis is increasingly going electric, according to the CBC. Municipalities are attracted by lower operating costs and greenhouse gas emissions compared with fossil fuel Zambonis. While cities like London and Mississauga have plans to fully convert their Zamboni fleet, Toronto has a long way to go to decarbonize its roughly 100 Zambonis. I'm Mike Moffat, and those are the 5 things that I'm watching this week.
Thanks, Mike. If you want to see a written copy of this week's top 5 list, Mike has put it online for you. It's at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. That is it for another episode of Smart Prosperity, the podcast. For more green economy thinking, check out the website for this podcast's parent organization. That's at institute.smartprosperity.ca. Meanwhile, the views shared on this podcast are not necessarily those of Smart Prosperity Institute. We just like having smart, evidence-based conversations about the green economy. I'm Eric Campbell. I'm broadcasting from the lands traditionally stewarded by the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and from a studio generously provided by the University of Ottawa. Thanks again for listening. The next episode is our annual year-end episode where we will hear from journalists on the top green economy stories of 2021. Don't miss it. That's happening December 8th. Talk to you then.